Here's the tightened version, with the hook and the closing lines kept word for word and every structural beat intact. Boots hit the floorboards hard and fast, cutting straight across a crowded room. A chair scraped back so sharp it nearly tipped. A big hand came down on top of it and held it still. Forks stopped halfway to open mouths. Every head at the long table turned at once. The fiddle music kept playing, but nobody was listening to it anymore. They were watching him. A tall man, trail dust still on his shoulders, a blue heeler dog pressed against his leg. He leaned down close to the one woman sitting all alone at the far end. And he said, quiet enough that only she could hear it, just 3 words: "Act like you're with me." Her name was Delamie Forsyth, and 2 summers of shame had taught her to keep her eyes on her plate. What made a stranger do that for her? So stay with me. Now let me back up and tell you how she got to that chair in the first place. Delamie Forsyth was the finest seamstress in Ellsworth, and everybody in town knew it. The wedding dress half the women at that feast were admiring, the one on the bride herself, Della had stitched every inch of it. The lace at the collar, the little pearl buttons down the back. 40 nights by lamplight, and her fingers had the needle marks to prove it. She made the beautiful things this town wore. She just wasn't allowed to be one of them. Think about that. Every fine thing in that town passed through her hands first. The christening gowns, the Sunday dresses, the burial clothes folks were laid to rest in. Della knew their measurements better than their husbands did. She knew which women were getting heavier and which were wasting away. She kept every secret a tape measure ever told her. And in return, the town let her sit at the far end of the table. 2 summers back, she had been engaged. Folks still talked about it. His name was Royal Caldwell, and he was the kind of man who looked good on a horse and knew it. Younger brother of the biggest cattle family for 40 miles. He had courted Della for the better part of a year, brought her wildflowers, told her right out on her own front step that she was the only honest thing in a town full of liars. She believed him. Why wouldn't she? A woman wants to believe the man who looks at her like that. And he was patient, which was the thing that fooled her. He came by the shop on Thursdays and pretended to need a button sewn on a coat that didn't need it. He walked her home from church the long way. He learned the names of every dress she was working on and asked after them like they were children. A man doesn't spend a year of Thursdays on a lie, she told herself. She let herself plan. She drew her own wedding gown a dozen ways on the back of order slips and burned them in the stove at night so nobody would see her hoping. Then a banker came up from Wichita with a daughter and a dowry, and Royal Caldwell did the math. He didn't even have the decency to tell Della himself. She heard it from a customer who came in to be fitted for a bonnet, who said it the way you'd mention the weather. You hear Royals marrying the Hartley girl, spring wedding, they say. Della had a mouthful of pins. She kept them there. She finished the hem. And she did not cry until the woman left. Here's the thing about a small town. It doesn't let you forget. Every Sunday she walked past the church where she was supposed to be married. Every market day somebody looked at her a half-second too long. The whisper followed her like a shadow. There goes Della. Almost a Caldwell. Wasn't quite enough, was she? And the cruelest part was how the story got bent in the telling. By the time it had gone around the town a few times, it wasn't Royal who had done wrong. It was Della. She must have been cold to him. She must have got above herself. She must have thought a seamstress could marry into the biggest cattle family in the county. Nobody ever said it to her face. They didn't have to. She heard it in the way the talk dropped off when she came near and started up again the second she passed. A town will protect its rich son and blame the poor woman every time, and call it common sense while it does it. So when the invitation came to the Caldwell Ranch wedding, she nearly threw it in the stove. It wasn't Royal getting married, not this time. It was his older brother Samuel marrying a sweet girl named Eliza. And Della had sewn that bride's gown with her own 2 hands. To stay home would be its own kind of confession. It would tell the whole town she was still bleeding. So she put on her good gray dress, the one with the blue piping she had made for herself 3 years ago, and she went. She should have known where they'd seat her. They put her at the very end of the feast table, past the cousins, past the children, down where the boards didn't quite meet, and a draft came up cold off the prairie. Alone. And 4 seats up, laughing with a glass of cider in his hand, sat Royal Caldwell himself, with the Hartley girl on his arm and a gold watch chain across his vest. He caught Della looking once. He smiled at her. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a man checking that his old work still hurt. Della took out her silver thimble. She always carried it, in the little pocket she sewed into every dress she made. She rolled it between her fingers under the table, round and round, the way some folks worry a coin or a cross. It had been her mother's before her, and her grandmother's before that, 3 generations of women who sewed for other people and never had much else to leave behind. It was the one thing that said you are good at something, you matter, no matter what they say down this end of the table. She kept her eyes on her plate. She told herself she only had to last the afternoon, eat a little, stay long enough to be seen. Then slip out before the dancing and walk home in the dark where nobody could watch her face. That's when the boots crossed the floor. She didn't look up at first. She felt him before she saw him, the way you feel a horse come up behind you. Then the chair beside her moved and that low voice landed close to her ear. Act like you're with me. She froze. The thimble stopped turning. She turned her head just enough to see him. A trail-worn man, maybe 35, sun lines around gray eyes, a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in a few days. At his boot sat a blue heeler dog, ears up, watching her like it was waiting on her answer too. He didn't look dangerous. He looked tired. And under the tired, he looked like a man who had made up his mind about something. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Folks down this way have been staring at you for an hour like you broke a window," he said, soft, easy, a smile already loading up for the crowd. "I figured you could use a different story. Just follow my lead. Can you do that?" Now Della was no fool. A stranger walks up out of nowhere and asks you to lie to 100 people. You ought to say no. Every sensible bone in her body said no. She had trusted a charming man with a good smile once before, and look where that put her. But Royal was 4 seats up, watching. And the whisper was already starting again. She could hear her name carried down the table on somebody's breath. There goes Della. And maybe that was it. Maybe a woman can only take being the saddest story in the room for so long before she'll gamble on a stranger just to be a different one. So Della Mee Forsyth, who had not gambled on a single thing since the last man who lied to her, lifted her chin and said, "All right." He didn't sit like a guest. He sat like a man coming home. He picked up the napkin, settled the dog with one word, "Down, Juniper," and then he turned to her, and he raised his voice just enough to carry. "You know," he said warmly, "I still remember the first time I saw you, Della. Will Foster's barn dance. You had that gray dress on, the very one, and I stepped on your foot so hard you near broke my hand slapping my shoulder." A few heads turned. Della's heart slammed. She had never been to a Will Foster barn dance with this man in her life. But his eyes held hers, steady, patient, "Give me something," and so she heard herself say, "You stepped on my foot twice. The second time was on purpose." The dog's tail thumped the floor, and the table laughed. Lord, how they laughed. The cousins leaned in. A gray-haired aunt put down her fork, because here is a truth about people. They will whisper cruelty all day, but offer them a love story and they will crowd around it like a fire on a cold night. They wanted it to be real. And the stranger, this Gideon Brock, fed it to them piece by piece, slow and sure, like a man laying out cards he knew would win. "Took me 3 months to work up the nerve to call on her proper," he told them. Her daddy ran me off the first time, said no drover was good enough. He glanced at Della, mock-wounded. She came out to the gate after, though, brought me a slice of pie wrapped in a cloth, said, "Come back Sunday and use the front door like a Christian." Della had no idea where the words were coming from, but now they came to her too easy, because somewhere in the last 5 minutes she had stopped acting. "It was apple pie," she said, "and you got crumbs in your beard and didn't notice for a mile." The aunt clapped her hands together. A young cousin sighed out loud, and down at the far cold end of the table, Delamere Forsyth was suddenly the most interesting woman in the room, and not one soul was whispering about Royal Caldwell anymore. She felt it happen. The shift. The warmth turning her way like the sun coming around a building. For the first time in 2 summers she sat up straight in her own skin. The stranger kept the story going, gentle, funny, never once cruel, and the dog leaned its warm weight against her ankle, and a plate of food finally got passed down to her end with a smile attached. Somebody refilled her cider. Somebody asked her a question and waited, actually waited, to hear the answer. A cousin's wife wanted to know how long they'd been keeping it quiet, and wasn't it just like a private soul to hide a sweetheart for a year? Della answered all of it. And the strange thing, the thing that scared her a little, was how good it felt to be on the inside of the warm circle for once instead of the cold edge of it. The toasts came and went. And in all of it, the danger seemed to just drain out of the afternoon. Royal had turned away, busy with his banker's daughter. The whispering had stopped. Della let her shoulders come down from around her ears. She looked at the strange, kind man beside her who had risked making a fool of himself for a woman he'd never met, and she said, quiet and real, "Thank you, truly. I don't know why you did that, but thank you." Gideon Brock looked at her for a long moment. Something passed behind his eyes, something heavier than the joke he'd been telling. He opened his mouth like he might tell her the real reason. Then he just shook his head and smiled. "Eat your supper, Della," he said. "Worst part's over." He was wrong about that. The worst part hadn't even started yet, because Royal Caldwell had been listening after all. A spoon rang against a glass. Sharp. Twice. The whole tent went quiet, the way a room does when money decides to speak. Royal stood, unhurried, that gold watch chain catching the light, and he smiled down the table with every tooth he owned. "Now hold on, everybody." His voice was friendly, that was the cruel part. It was so friendly. "I've got to say something because this is just about the sweetest thing I've heard all year." He looked straight at Gideon. "Mister, I don't believe we've met. Brock, was it? Gideon Brock." "That's right," Gideon said. He didn't stand. He just set down his fork. "See, here's my trouble." Royal spread his hands, playing to the crowd, and the crowd, God help them, turned to watch. "I've lived in this town my whole life. I know every barn dance Will Foster ever threw. I was at most of them. And I have never, not one single time, heard the name Gideon Brock. Funny, isn't it? A 3-month courtship. Pie at the gate. And nobody in Ellsworth ever laid eyes on you until you walked in that flap an hour ago, trail dust and all." His smile turned to Della, and it was a knife now. "Della, honey, you feeling all right? Or are you just so desperate to look spoke, for that you'd let a saddle tramp make up stories at my brother's wedding?" And there it was, everything changed in a breath. This wasn't about pity anymore, pity you can survive. This was a man with the whole town in his pocket, calling her a liar to her face, calling her desperate, dragging her shame out into the middle of the floor and stomping on it for sport. And he wasn't alone. He was a Caldwell at a Caldwell wedding on Caldwell land, and every person under that tent ate Caldwell beef. Half of them owed the family money. The other half wanted to. The laughter that had warmed Della 2 minutes ago could turn on her in one. She could feel 100 faces deciding which way to fall, and she knew which way a crowd falls when the richest man in the county shows it where. Her hand found the thimble in her pocket and gripped it so hard the edge bit her palm. If you've ever sat at a table and watched a powerful person decide to make an example of someone weaker, just to remind the room who's in charge, then you already know exactly how that silence felt. And if a story has ever pulled you in this far, do me one small favor and tap that subscribe button, because what Gideon Brock did next is the whole reason I had to tell you this one. Royal wasn't done. He never knew when to stop, that was always his trouble. "Tell you what," he said, soaking it up. "Let's hear it from the man himself. Go on, Brock. Tell us all how you courted Ardella. Tell us about the pie. Or," he paused and let it hang, "or you can admit you never met this poor woman before today, and we can all stop pretending." The dog, Juniper, rose up off the floor. A low sound came out of her, not loud, just enough. Gideon dropped one hand to her head and she went quiet. Then Gideon Brock stood up. He stood slow. He was a big man, and when he came up to his full height the front row leaned back a little. But he didn't square up to fight. His hands stayed open at his sides. He looked around the tent, at all those waiting faces, and when he spoke his voice was so steady and so plain that it carried clear to the back without him raising it at all. "He's right," Gideon said. The whole tent inhaled. "I never met this woman before today. There wasn't any barn dance. There wasn't any pie at the gate. I made every word of it up, and I made it up about an hour ago, walking across this floor." He let that sit. Della's face went hot, then cold. She wanted the ground to open. "So if you came here to catch me in a lie, mister, congratulations. You caught me. I lied to all of you." Royal's grin spread wide. He thought he'd won. You could see it. "But," Gideon said, and that one word stopped the room like a hand on a chest, "I'd like to tell you why. And then you can decide which man at this table ought to be ashamed." He reached up to his own collar. He pulled at a leather cord around his neck, the kind a man wears under his shirt where nobody sees it. And off the end of that cord into his rough open palm slid a thin gold wedding ring. "This belonged to my wife," Gideon said. "Her name was Ruth. We were married 6 years. She could ride better than me and shoot better than me, and she never once let me forget either one." A few people smiled. It died fast because they saw where his face was going. "She took a fever 2 winters back. There wasn't a doctor close enough. I held her hand for 3 days, and on the 3rd day she was gone." He turned the little ring over in his fingers. "I buried her on a Tuesday, 2 years ago, this Tuesday, today. You could have heard a pin drop in the next county. I've been on the trail with a herd for 6 weeks, he went on, and I didn't even rightly know what day it was until I rode in this morning and somebody said, 'Wedding today.' And it hit me what day it was, the day I lost her." He let out a breath. "I'll be honest with you. I almost rode on. Last thing a man wants on the anniversary of his wife's death is to sit through somebody else's vows, listen to a preacher say, 'Till death do you part,' and know exactly what those words cost. But I'm hauling Caldwell cattle and I had business, so I came in, and I stood at the back of this tent, alone." His eyes found Della, and they softened. "And then I looked down to the far end of the table, and I saw a woman sitting all by herself, cold spot, bad seat, a whole town buzzing about her and not one person looking her in the eye, and she had her chin down and she was turning something over and over in her pocket, just trying to get through the day." He nodded slow. "I know that look. I have worn that look. I have been the loneliest person in a crowded room, and let me tell you, there is no lonelier place on this earth. A man alone on the open prairie, that's just quiet. But alone in the middle of 100 laughing people, that's the kind of alone that gets into your bones." He set the ring down on the white tablecloth, gentle, right where everyone could see it. "So no, I never courted Della Forsythe, But I'll tell you what was true in every word I said. She is somebody worth crossing a room for. She has a quick wit and a kind voice and a steel in her she doesn't even know she's got. I learned all that in 5 minutes. 5 minutes. He turned to Royal then, and his voice didn't rise, but it changed, the way the air changes before weather. You had a whole year, and you traded her for a dowry and let this town call her the desperate one. So go ahead and tell everybody I'm a liar, mister. I told one lie this afternoon to spare a stranger some pain. How many you told her over a year to get what you wanted? Nobody breathed. Royal's smile was gone. His face had gone blotchy and tight. Now you listen here, drover. You don't come onto my family's land and— It's Samuel's land today, Gideon said. It's his wedding. And you stood up in the middle of it to make a lonely woman cry, for sport. He shook his head, almost sad. That's the part I can't get past, friend. Of all the days, you picked your own brother's wedding to be cruel. And then something happened that Della would remember to the end of her days. The bride stood up. Eliza, in the gown Della had sewn 40 nights to finish, rose at the head of the table with her cheeks wet and her jaw set, and she said in a clear young voice, "Royal Caldwell, sit down. You've shamed this family enough for one afternoon. Della made my dress with her own hands, every stitch. She was kinder to me in her shop than anybody in this family has been all year. She is my guest, and she is welcome here, and you will not say one more word to her." She looked at the stranger, and her voice cracked. "Mr. Brock, I'm so sorry about your Ruth. You sit with us as long as you like." Then the gray-haired aunt stood. "Hear, hear." Then a cousin. Then Samuel the groom himself, who put a hand on his brother's shoulder, not gentle, and said low, "Sit, Royal." Now, one by one, up and down that long table people turned, and it was Royal Caldwell who suddenly had nowhere to put his eyes. The whisper he'd lived on his whole life had finally turned around and found him. But the thing that broke Della open, the thing she never saw coming, was her own self standing up. She hadn't planned it. Her legs just did it. And once she was on her feet, the words came, shaky at first, then strong. "He's right that I was sitting here trying to get through the day," she said. "I've been getting through the day for 2 summers. And in all that time, not one of you," she swept her eyes down the table, "not cruel, just true, not one of you crossed this floor to ask if I was all right. You let me sew your daughter's wedding dresses, and you wouldn't save me a seat at the warm end of a table. He did, a stranger. On the worst day of his year, with his wife's ring around his neck, he stood up for me instead of sitting down in his own sorrow." She turned to Gideon, and now her eyes were streaming and she didn't care. "So I'll say it plain in front of everybody. The story wasn't true, but I wish to God it had been. And if it's all the same to you, Gideon Brock, I'd like to start it for real." The tent came apart. People were crying, the aunt loudest of all. Juniper barked twice and spun in a circle. And Gideon Brock, the trail-worn widower who hadn't planned on feeling a single thing that day, picked his wife's ring up off the table, closed his fist around it, pressed that fist to his chest, and reached his other hand out to Della Mee. She took it. In front of the whole town, in front of Royal. She took his hand. Royal Caldwell left before the cake was cut, slipped out the back flap with his banker's daughter and his gold watch, and not one person stopped him or said goodbye. Funny how that works. A man spends his whole life buying the room's good opinion, and it turns out the room was only ever rented. Della and Gideon stayed till the lanterns were lit. They didn't talk much at first. They sat at that same far end of the table, except now it wasn't the cold, lonely end anymore. Folks kept drifting down to it. The aunt brought Della a second slice of cake and squeezed her shoulder and said, "You always were too good for that Caldwell boy, honey. The whole town knew it. We just—" She trailed off. "Well, we should have said so to your face." And that, more than anything, was the apology Della had waited 2 summers to hear. It didn't undo it, but it was something, and she was old enough now to take something and be glad of it. Gideon told her about Ruth, the real things, The way she hummed when she cooked, and how she taught him to dance in their own kitchen so he wouldn't embarrass her at a wedding someday. Della laughed, wet-eyed, and told him the dancing clearly hadn't taken, since his made-up self had stepped on her foot twice. He laughed at that, a real laugh, maybe the first in 2 years, and the sound of it surprised him. You could see it cross his face, like a man who'd forgotten he still had it in him. She told him about the thimble, pulled it out of her pocket and showed him, sitting there in her palm, scratched and dull and dear. When everything went bad, she said, this was the thing that reminded me I was still good at something, that I still mattered even when I felt like I didn't. My mother sewed with it. Her mother before that. 3 women holding a needle so other folks could look fine on their best days. Gideon looked at the thimble, then at the ring on its cord around his neck, and he understood it completely, because he carried the very same kind of thing, just shaped different. 2 people who'd each been holding on to one small object to remind themselves they were still here. He had to ride out the next morning. The herd was waiting, and a drover doesn't get to stay put. He told her so plain, no pretty promises, because he'd had enough of pretty promises, and so had she. But before he swung up into the saddle, with Juniper already loping ahead, he came back across the yard to where Della stood, boots on hard ground, crossing the distance to her one more time. She remembered the first time he'd crossed a floor toward her, a stranger with a borrowed story. This time there was no story. This time it was just a man who meant it. I deliver to the Caldwells twice a year, he said, spring and fall. I'll be back through in October. He turned his hat in his hands, suddenly bashful as a boy. I'd take it as a kindness if you'd let me call on you proper, front door, like a Christian. A grin tugged at him. Maybe even bring the pie this time. Delamere Forsyth, who had stopped gambling on men the day Royal Caldwell did his arithmetic, looked at this tired, honest, grieving, generous man and made the second best bet of her life. The best one she'd already made, when she lifted her chin at a feast table and said, "All right." "October," she said, "I'll be at the front gate." He came back in October, and the spring after, and the spring after that he didn't ride on. They were married in the little church Della used to dread walking past, and she sewed her own dress, every inch of it, with the silver thimble on her finger. Juniper sat in the front pew and would not be made to leave. And when the preacher asked who gave this woman, half the town tried to answer at once, because by then they had all decided they'd loved her all along. Gideon kept Ruth's ring on its cord around his neck till the day he died, and Della never once asked him to take it off. Some folks thought that was strange. It wasn't, though. She understood it better than anybody. A heart that big enough to cross a crowded room for a stranger on the worst day of his year, well, a heart like that doesn't have to let go of one love to make room for another. It just gets bigger. That was the man she married. You want to know the truth of it? The story he made up at that table, the barn dance and the pie and the daddy at the gate, none of it ever happened. But sit at their kitchen table 20 years on, with the grandchildren gathered round and the fire going, and listen to old Gideon tell it. He told that made-up story his whole life, word for word, every time exactly the same. And every single time Della would look up from her sewing, that same scratched thimble on her finger, and she'd say, "You stepped on my foot twice." The second time was on purpose, and the whole room would laugh. A lie, somebody might say, but I don't think it was. I think it was just a true thing that took the long way around to happen. Some men, you see, carry a strength that has nothing to do with their fists. Gideon Brock walked into a room full of his own grief and chose, instead, to lift up a stranger. And in the lifting, both of them were saved. That's the whole story. That's why I had to tell it. Thanks for staying with me all the way to the end. Tightened to roughly 5,000 words, within the 4,805,200 target. The hook is untouched at exactly 150 words. The closing lines land identically, and every beat is preserved. The cuts came entirely from trimming redundant phrasing in the setup, the warm circle stretch, Gideon's monologue, and the resolution, not from removing developments.